This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. I have here with me Jan Dubiel once again, who is Early Childhood Education Consultant, Advisor and Programme Director for Hempsall's Early Years. Thank you, Jan, for joining me today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And today we're going to be discussing data in early childhood. So a question or a topic, I guess, that a lot of people discuss in various ways, can be quite controversial. And common questions posed by the sector are whether we're collecting too much data in early years, are we doing too many assessments, and the term datafication is used quite a lot, which I know, Jan, you don't really agree with, as your view is that data is not as bad as we make it out to be.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack in this. So if we start backwards, the term datafication is, I think, a really, really unhelpful term, because the word data means information. So datafication means information-ication, which doesn't even make sense. So I think there is a feeling, and I think it's something we might explore during this conversation. There is a feeling of resistance to having data around early years, because it's felt it's inappropriate, or it's doesn't help, or it's doing something for data's sake, and so on. And I understand all those dimensions and all those concerns. But I start from the premise that having information about children is an essential, fundamental part of what we do as educators, as policymakers, as strategists, as everyone involved in the early years profession. We rely on information in order to do that, information about children. And even in the earliest foundation stage, we have the term of the unique child, or that unique child is constructed through the information we have about them, and so on. So the idea of information runs through everything we do. So if we transpose or interchange the words data and information, and we say they're actually the same thing, which they are, then I think the narrative becomes very different. I don't think anyone would say we don't need any information about children.
Yeah.
So I think we need to delineate at this point what we mean by data and the way it's understood, which might be slightly different. And immediately people think about data sets and spreadsheets and numerical data and so on. And I think there's often a resistance to that, which I understand, but I've got to say I think is misplaced. Actually, I think having good, robust, reliable data sets about children, about cohorts of children, about groups of children, is a really useful way of both protecting and enhancing what we know is right for children. Now, the issue comes from the fact that, and there's a really good quote by Einstein, which is, what is counted doesn't often count, and we often don't count the things that really count. And what it means, I've misplaced that.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking in my head, like, how does that make sense?
Do you want to get the proper quote right?
I actually have it here.
It's in the article.
In your article, where you did get it correct. Just having a look. So not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts.
Yes, that's much better, isn't it? So actually, I'll just refer to it in the article. Right. So in the article, I use that Einstein quote about counting things that don't matter, but actually the things that do matter can't be counted. And I think that really typifies and epitomizes the challenge we have in early years, because the things that really matter in early childhood can't really be necessarily quantified in the same way that you would quantify things that are easy to count. So if, for instance, if you looked at the number of phonemes children know, or the numbers they know, or the shapes they can name, that's very kind of tangible, easy to construct data broadly. But when we're talking about things like motivation or curiosity or self-regulation or metacognition or cognitive flexibility, they're all things which are massively, massively important, but we can't quantify them in quite the same way. So I think we need to be quite creative and quite open-minded about doing that, because I think by constructing data sets around that, then we have a basis on which to be able to describe and represent what is important in early years. And it's from that that we have that dialogue about why those things are important and why they need to be supported. Otherwise, we get sucked into things that are just easy to quantify, or things that are easy to count. So while I understand the sort of narrative of datafication as a pejorative thing, I think we have to move beyond that. And actually, I think if we don't create data sets that can be interpreted and understood by people outside the profession, then it will get done for us. And we have our early years history in England. Certainly, we have many examples of that. So I think it's about biting the bullet on this, perhaps not being squeamish about the word data, and saying, okay, how can we represent children's learning authentically and accurately? What can we do to create codifications of information that make sense, that don't compromise principles, that don't compromise realities of children, but can be used as a way in which we discuss where children are, what children need, and how they're progressing. And it's very interesting. So I've done a lot of work around the idea, the concept of progress, and how we look at progress. And one of the things I talk about is that progress isn't always sequential. It's about deepening learning and understanding. So when we're looking at data, we're looking at information, we're looking at how secure is a knowledge, how deepened is a child's understanding, how internalized is their ability to use it. And that's the challenge, because that's what needs to be represented. And I think if we can do that, then it really does support the profile of what we do and the professionalism of what we do. I think when we say things like, we use the term datafication, or we say things like, oh, we don't agree with data in early years, we immediately alienate ourselves from the rest of the educational world. And there is, and I know this is a separate issue which we've talked about before, in terms of the language we use. We have a very particular dialect in early years. We use terminology that nobody else uses in the rest of the education infrastructure. We use words which mean different things to other people, but they mean something very specific to us. And the word play is one of the examples. We talk about play-based learning, but people outside early years hear the word play and they have a completely different view of it. And I think we do need to be really conscious of that. And I don't know, that's a kind of separate strand of thought, but I think the word data falls within that. We should talk about data, but we should early yearsify it. And we should say the data we have in early years is from this, it's collected and collated like this, and this is what it means. And these are the things it looks at, which might not get looked at anywhere else because they're so critical to early years. But these are things which we think are important to know about, so we can support that, so that children are more likely to be successful. And again, this, I mean, two things. One, this feeds on a huge amount of longitudinal studies which show the impact of early years has a resounding effect way through children's educational career, right up to kind of late teenager, late adolescent, early adulthood, and so on. And it's also, actually, if we're saying, which we are, that early years is really important and it sets the foundation, the framework for everything else that is later built upon, then we have a massive responsibility to do that right. And data is a way of knowing whether or not we're getting it right or not. Otherwise, it becomes something very, very kind of amorphous and ethereal.
I guess data plays a part in our reflection as practitioners, because essentially we are reflecting on analysing whether what we are doing is the best way possible for the children. It's the best kind of practice, and it probably forms that kind of observation, assessment kind of cycle that we discuss. So there's a lot of data there, and we understand as practitioners that we need to observe children, and we're constantly observing, even if we're not recording that. So there's constantly information or data that we are taking in and analysing even if we're not recording it. So I guess the issue often may lie in when we do start to record that data, it takes up a lot of time. And then perhaps we don't really see the value in it because we're then not really using that data after we've recorded it. We don't really look at it again. I think that's oftentimes the issue there, because then it's taken us away from the children. But what was the purpose of it?
No, and that's opened up another really really important dimension to this, which is that the data is created from your knowledge of the child. So as an educator, you are collecting information all the time. You build up your relationship with the child, you construct that your knowledge of the child that way. And that is what has to be the data. Data shouldn't be something separate. It's something that is represented from your knowledge of the child. And I think that's one of the key elements, because in the past, what we struggled with is people doing one thing for teaching and learning and supporting children and so on, and then doing another thing for data, or doing something very specific to generate data. And that's possibly where the antipathy comes from, which I completely agree with. You shouldn't be doing anything just for data. If you know children well enough, if you're engaging and interacting with them and working with them, which you do, that's the information which, there is an alchemy to making that into the data set you look at. So I think what you said just then is really important, and possibly that's part of the baggage around the word data, is that something we had to do that's pointless. It doesn't engage with the children. It takes us away from the children. And I think that's part of a cultural, with the small c, a cultural shift that we're experiencing, to say actually that it's the same information, but we're codifying it to make sense of it, so that other people can look at it and we can have that conversation about the importance of what we do and the impact of what we do and the long-term impact of what we do. Because what's really interesting about research is the things in early years which are really significant aren't the things that necessarily you measure and that you're aware of later on, but actually they're almost under the surface driving that. So things like self-regulation, things like metacognition, things like certainly development of language, physical development, PSED, they're all things which may not get assessed as children get older, but knowing that they're secure in early years and in early childhood, knowing that they're working with those intact and embedded, enables them to be successful in more discrete, definable academic areas. So there is a big piece of work about informing people who engage with early years data, what it means and why it's significant and what's significant and why it's different and why it may not directly and obviously match with kind of things that happen later on. But I think that's all part of a narrative of making sure people understand about early years, because it's where learning starts. It's where those children who become successful and become successful PhD students, that all starts in early years. It starts with those early experiences and getting those right and getting the motivations right and getting the context of that right and getting the things which are perhaps under the surface a little bit, getting those in place, is really, really important.
I guess we can really advocate for the sector if we do have that data in place, because we've got a stronger case then. So instead of it being anecdotal and case study based, it is a lot more evidence based, and that is what people trust, don't they?
Absolutely, and the EYFS profile is a case in point. It's now 20. We've had it for 21 years, and it's become a reference point. It's the only data we have, national data we have for early years. So it becomes this very, very focused reference point that everybody looks at. Everyone looks at profile data because it's the indicator of where children are at the end of their reception year on the transition to Key Stage 1. And so it's a really good example of how people could work with it. Although obviously there's a huge amount of understanding that goes into looking at, percentages of children with GLD or percentage of children who got this particular expected in this particular area. You have to have an understanding of how it works in order to be able to engage with that data. So it's, in a way, it's a bit like a proxy for data as a whole. I think if people take the effort to understand the profile and how it works and what it means, the data makes a lot more sense. And I think that's part of a process I think we need to be engaged with.
I think that with the profile, a lot of people see it as almost not where are the children at the end of the early years and kind of how far have they come, almost, or everything that they've learned in the early years, but instead what's their starting point, starting school or formal school, like, year one, key stage one. So actually almost like saying, well, this is where they are in early years, and then this is how far this is how far we've taken them once we can see the results in year 6. So it's kind of like not really looking at the early years side of things. It's just data for the future. So I think a lot of people see it as not valuing the early years stage of development. So if we switch the narrative and see it the way that you said it, that's completely different then. Celebrating what they have achieved in early years rather than using it as a baseline and then celebrating what they've achieved only in primary.
No, absolutely. I think again, I think there's a lot to unpack in that, because there is a connection between, for example, outcomes in profile data and later outcomes. There's a piece of research published recently which showed the correlation between a good level of development and 5 GCSEs in the secondary school. And it's a very crude correlation, because obviously we know it's far more intricate and complex, and there are huge amounts of variables within that. But I think things like that as a starting point for discussion, a starting point to look at that continuum, can be really powerful. But I suppose the point is it doesn't stop there. It doesn't just stop with the raw data. It's about understanding the context, understanding how it works. And I think we also wrestle with the fact that we have profile data at the end of reception. But the end of reception is, for most children, at least 2 years. I've already had 2 years of EYFS. For some children, it's longer. We're not looking. That's not a starting point. That's the end. The end of the EYFS.
I don't think many people see it in that way when they look at the profile. They kind of see it in terms of it being used for, like I said, for primary schools to then kind of say, well, this is how far we've taken the children over these primary years. So is it just redefining, I guess, these the data, the assessments, how we look at them, and redefining or properly defining terminology in relation to early years, also defining these assessments, or at least using them to our advantage. They're there, and even if we are very much against data, actually, how can we use these assessments to really support our work with children and families? And I know that actually this reminds me of David Meacham's articles around data in early years. He kind of talks about some research that he did around it might have been the baseline assessment actually, and saying, well, he was against it, and he was kind of lobbying it, and actually in the end, it's there, we have to do it, so let's make the best out of it.
Yeah, which is a paradigm we all wrestle with, isn't it? Do we make the best of? Do we make it as least worse as it can be, or do we can resist and take ourselves outside it? That's another really good example of that.
So in terms of the reception baseline assessment, which I know is very controversial and has been controversial, what are your views on that, and is that useful data?
Well, I think it's really important, and I totally support a baseline in reception, because at the very least, as it is for all kinds of reasons, and that's another discussion, it is a starting, for a lot of children, it's a start of school with a capital S. And establishing a starting point for that, I think, is what you do anyway as an educator. And as a reception teacher, I would do an informal baseline, because I needed to know where children were in order to support their learning. And as I said, there is an alchemy that you then turn that and codify that into how you can represent it. So I think the idea of a baseline, I absolutely support. I mean, I do find the current approach to it problematic. Or that's my kittens in the background, sorry.
Well, are you going to show us the kittens? I was
No.
excited to see them actually.
So
I'll have to
right,
get them later.
so I find the current manifestation of baseline that we have is problematic, because first of all, you can't use it as an educator. The data is black boxed, and actually you won't see it until a child's year 6. So that does raise a immediate challenge about its purpose.
That's what I was saying earlier, how that's when educators think it's not useful to them because they don't actually do anything with that data.
Yeah, exactly. It also the things that it assesses aren't necessarily what I would consider, and I think what research suggests are the most important things. So it is a problem. I do think I would say I do think we should have a baseline, and we have in the past had very effective baselines, which have done all of those things and been useful and assessed the right things in the right way and things that really matter. So I would like to think we've had some good examples in the past where we have assessed the right things and in the right way, and we've created robust data sets, and actually that they've been really good in providing this overview, a national overview of children as they start reception, and that that I would argue from all kinds of points of view that's that'd be a really useful thing to have. So it's not having a baseline that I think is the issue. I think it's the type of baseline, and it's the way it's constructed, and it's what it looks at, and how that information is or isn't used.
Yeah, how we use that data, where it goes, and whether it can feed back into the children right now rather than in X amount of years in the future.
Yeah.
So I guess it's really about focusing on the data that works for you as an educator, as a setting, and what data works for the children initially. So that's the first focus, and then using that data to share it more widely. So the first focus is the children. Does it work for the children? Does it work for me as an educator, us as a setting? And then let's use this data that works to then share widely rather than the other way around.
No, absolutely. That's exactly the right way it needs to work. As I said before, right, the purpose of data is to support your understanding of your children. That's where it comes from, and you build that up informally most of the time, every time you interact with children, every time you work with them. And it's about codifying that for its secondary purpose, which is to say, this is how the impact we've had on children, this is how they've progressed, this is how we can demonstrate how these things this has worked.
That makes me think that early childhood educators and then the early childhood sector really needs to take the lead on data rather than, as you say, kind of shying away from it and contesting it. Actually, we need to say this. Yes, data is important, and this is how we would like to use it. This is what assessments we would like to see, and this is what works for us and the children. So we really need to take that lead rather than it sort of being the other way around, kind of top down.
Absolutely,
from the government.
Absolutely, and I think as I said before, I think we need to early yearsify the concept or early yearsify the narrative, so that actually we're saying this is what it shows and this is where it comes from. The other dimension, and it's interesting, I'm doing some work with groups and some local authorities on this, from organisations, is to look at that juxtapositioning between educational data and health data, because actually there's a huge overlap between them, and although they come from very different traditions and very different sort of pathways, they do combine to form this more multi-dimensional picture of the child. So I think there is a lot of data. For example, there's a lot of informal data in the health profession around individual children, and I think there's a really interesting piece of work around how this combines together. So as I said, we have this much more rounded picture. And I know that's work that's going on in some places, because they want to look at the impact of different initiatives, and whether it makes a difference to those children in a whole range of ways. And obviously children's health, their well-being, things which are perhaps slightly more clinically measurable, are really, really important. And we have to see how that again interplays with what is slightly more subjective data that we gather as educators in terms of their learning development, acquisition of knowledge, and so on.
And that kind of reminds me of the Leuven scales as well. I know you mentioned that in your article. What is it that you were saying there? What's your view on the Leuven scales?
The Leuven scales is a really good example, because it's ultimately a numerical score. It's highly researched. It comes from a very particular perception and view of what matters for children: their well-being, their attachment, their security, which is the basis, a prerequisite for learning. So low levels of well-being will not encourage children to be effective learners. So it fits with that kind of model. And then their level of involvement, and the level of involvement is around the intensity and the depth of their learning, not necessarily the actual academic or content context of what they're learning. So it's a very, very good starting point for looking at the effectiveness of a setting. If children have high levels of well-being, they're highly involved in whatever they're doing, they're showing these deep levels of concentration and deep levels of engagement. That's a starting point for saying what's going on here is really working for those children. So again, it's an amazingly simple but also complex tool. And again, it generates numerical data. It's a very, very good example of how it can work, because people can say, before we did this initiative, children's average level of well-being was 3.4. After we did this initiative, their average levels of well-being rose to 4.7. Now that's quite bland numerical score, but actually when you understand what levels of well-being and involvement mean, you can see why that's significant and why that matters. And it's the numerical score which starts that conversation. And then you have to understand it, you have to unpack it, you have to drill down, you have to do all the things that understand it. So that's a very good example of how we can use data effectively, not as the final end product, but as a way of having that conversation and explaining and exploring the impact that we have on children. Leuven scales, and how it creates a raw numerical number, but when you unpack it and you understand it, you realize why that's significant. And if we start using data in that way, contextualized and understood by people, then it's actually could be quite potent in terms of what we do, in terms of protecting and supporting and explaining the nature of early childhood education.
And then that kind of data becomes really useful for us as educators in understanding whether what we do is effective. So, whether the time and effort we're spending on a certain practice, pedagogy, intervention, whatever it may be, and whether that perhaps the money invested is actually supporting children, or it might not be making a difference. So it is vital to be able to analyze that data, to gain that data in the first place, and then analyze it. So it's all about collecting the right data and then using it, analyze it and using it in the correct way to feed back into our practice with the children. It's a whole full cycle thing, isn't it? Rather than just collecting data that we're told to collect, passing it on, and then we don't ever see it again and it doesn't impact the children. Or that's how educators feel anyway.
No, absolutely. And really effective educators are very good at looking and analysing data and using it to pinpoint specific areas for development or areas of interest or concern. And I suppose it's having that kind of relationship with data that we want to aspire to. And it is, I think there's a key thing, I think we started the conversation with, about that data being authentic, about it being real, about it being about the stuff that really matters, and going back to that Einstein quote. So I think there's the potential for a big cultural shift to really embrace data fully, but to take ownership of it. And that's something you said, we need to take ownership of it, and we need to define it, and that's absolutely right. And again, that's part of, I think, of our about advocacy for
Yes.
the profession is explain to people who are not early years specialists what that means, why it looks like that, and why that's significant. So that example I gave you about higher levels of well-being or involvement, you would need to understand it in order to understand why that's significant. So it's not the data itself, it's the fact that the data changes, and that reflects this greater depth of understanding for children, greater sense of security, greater sense of involvement, and that we know will lead to better outcomes because it increases their neurological connections, their understanding, and so on. So seeing it in that context, I think, is really important too. And I think early years is possibly the hardest sector where we do that, because of the nature of children and because of particularly the holistic nature in which children learn and are taught, and having to kind of work with that is one of the real challenges.
And like you said, it's just difficult to collect data on certain things, isn't it? Not everything can be quantified in that way, especially through such a quantitative lens rather than that qualitative aspect in terms of data and research. But it reminds me of the term that we use a lot actually is evidence-based practice. So, we need to know that what we're doing is based on evidence, some kind of evidence somewhere, some kind of data, because otherwise why are we doing it? How do we know it works?
How do we know
doing
exactly?
it just for the sake of it?
Exactly. And I think you've raised this kind of interplay between quantitative and qualitative evidence, and we will need both. We will always need qualitative evidence, which breathes life into it and makes it makes it real. But I think we also need quantifiable evidence, which runs alongside that and is entwined with that, which gives us kind of hard information about that's interpretable in terms of progress and outcomes and impact.
And it is all for the benefit of the children and the sector. That, I guess, that's what we need to remember and challenge data in that way of, is it making a difference? Is collecting this data going to be useful, rather than let's not collect any data and all data is bad. So it's just reframing our thinking around it, I guess, and not being as black and white, perhaps.
No, and I think that the worst situation to be in is when you've got when things are presented as a binary choice, and very few things in life are binary in that sense. Very few things are either or. So it's finding an accommodation of sort of both of those elements, having absurd amounts of unusable and irrelevant data to having no data at all. If those are the two extremes, then we find somewhere in the middle where we make something that's a genuine, authentic, and real, and useful, and supports us.
Well, I think we'll round it off there, as our conversation led to many kind of different avenues, and I feel like we've touched on a lot of different things, but it will probably be useful to have some more kind of discussions and further episodes around specific assessments, perhaps, and really unpicking those more in depth. But this was certainly a great start to that conversation and debate around data and datafication and assessments. So thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you.
And we will hear from you again soon, no doubt. And also our listeners can find Jan's article around data in early childhood on the Voice of Early Childhood website. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.